You know me.
A couple of days ago, Harada-san did an interview on this Japanese live stream YouTube account. This is something that he was talking about on Twitter beforehand, where he was basically saying if you guys have really old pictures of like Evo, you're talking about like when it first kicked off, before you had all the spectacles and the reveals and thousands of people showing up, when it was a grassroots event. He wanted pictures because he had to do this live stream and talk about how Tekken has grown. And during this whole live stream, that's basically what he did. There's a lot of good information in here, and I'm just going to go screenshot by screenshot and break it down. The first screenshot here, you have a breakdown of how Tekken as a series has sold. At the top, I translated it, and it basically says Tekken 8 as a series had sold over 58 million copies in players' homes, and the biggest portion of that is Europe plus Oceania plus the Middle East plus Africa. So there's a lot of things taken into consideration in this 51%, but that's over half. Now, North America and South America makes up 3%, and then Southeast Asia is 8%, other Asia is 5%, and then Japan is 3%. The share of arcade version is overwhelmingly Asia and Japan. But for home use, 97% is sold outside of Japan, a completely worldwide title. On this screenshot here, you have the sales broken down a little bit more. 40% goes to Europe, and then you have North America at 24%, and then you have Latin and South America 8%, and then you have the Middle East at 7%, South Asia at 7%, Oceania 5%, Japan 4%, Africa 3%, and then 2% is other. So you can see this is how all of the game is broke down throughout the whole series, not just Tekken 8. And when you talk about, Harada always says like, X character is popular in this region, X character is popular in that region. When he says something like that, it gives you, it just puts it into perspective how important that truly is, because when he says a character like Shahid being popular in the Middle East, I mean, we don't want to completely rule it out, but they only make up 7% of the player base. So how popular is that really? On this screenshot here, you have the official sales of each Tekken game. Now we've seen unofficial versions, but to have the official raw numbers is pretty shocking. So the first Tekken, 2.8 million copies. Then you have Tekken 2, 5.7 million copies. So that's a huge improvement over the first one. And then what a lot of people didn't realize, and I was very shocked to know this, a lot of people didn't know that Harada-san was not the creator of Tekken. The creator of Tekken was actually this person here, the creator of Tekken and the co-creator of Virtual Fighter. There was another person who played a big hand in helping them do great things with that franchise. But when Harada steps up, because he was always a part of the franchise, but when he steps up and takes over, it's Tekken 3. And under his leadership, they were able to turn that 5.7 into an 8.4 million. And a lot of people argue this is like the best Tekken ever made, right? So you can see Harada stepped up to the leadership role and delivered. But they got a little bit too experimental in Tekken 4, which is what Harada admitted. And that game did half of the numbers, right? Because Tekken 3 did something perfect, and then they got happy and they experimented, and that experiment didn't pan out. Now, a lot of people look back fondly on that, right? The obstacles, ceilings, and stuff like that, the aesthetics, the vibes, but it just didn't pan out in terms of sales. It was a complete 180 on what made Tekken 3 so popular. The thing about Tekken 4, Harada said himself that they went back to the basics. Tekken 4 was pretty experimental, so when they wanted to make Tekken 5, first off, Harada took a break, right? He took a break, he stepped away from the franchise. It's all documented in the book that they released. Is that he came back a couple of years later, and that's when they finally, you can see 3 years later, that's when they made Tekken 5. And their idea behind it is, let's go back to what works. And you can see they made another greatest Tekken of all time with Tekken 5, 9.4 million copies, right? And this is also when Michael Murray showed up in Tekken 5. So both of these guys worked together to do that. And then Tekken Tag Tournament 2, the most controversial Tekken, this one flopped harder than any other Tekken on this list with 1.8 million copies. Players argue to this day whether or not this game would have lived if they did this, if they did that. And me personally, I just think this game came at a horrible time, and it was not able to compete with some of the other games out there. They also got very experimental with this, but basically they have to figure out why every time they get experimental does the game do poorly. For Tekken 4, they experimented, half the sales. After Tekken 5 and 6, they experimented, horrible sales. So with Tekken 7 and Tekken 8, they have to prevent that from happening. This is a really interesting screenshot as well. It kind of just shows what the games are scored on Metacritic. The highest rated Tekken is Tekken 3 with a 96. Tekken 8 came close to that with a 90-91. And by the way, this is kind of a fraud because there's no shops in there, there's no skins in there. If they were to rescore the game with all of that stuff in there, it would probably be lower. You had a news article come out and say that. If they had the shopping stuff in there at launch, we would have docked points. So you would have to assume that Metacritic would have done the same. Here's where things get a little more interesting. He talks about how Tekken is a 3D game. And you can see here in this graph how they have the X, Y, and Z, and how the players move accordingly to that. You can see with Tekken 7 they have the green lines, and it kind of just shows how, like, the more technical side of the game. Here is another look at basically what he means. This orange box down here is basically the stage where we fight, but then you have all of this stuff they have to build and design so it looks like an actual play stage. When you look from an above area like this, it looks really bad, but we all know how amazing the game looks when you're in the thick of it, right? So that's just a peek behind the curtain. They also have this little animation here where you can see, because his hitboxes is kind of a square, and this is how 2D fighting games do it. It's all squares, and the fist is a square and it's moving. But for Tekken 8, you got to get a little bit more complicated because it's a three-dimensional area. And basically what it's saying is that they use cylinders and they use circles. So for the left side, you can see that they use circles on all the joints, on the parts that bend and whatnot. And when you talk about the hitbox itself on the right side, you can see these huge cylinders. So this is why sometimes you get hit when you don't really get hit, because you're hitting the hitbox and not the actual character. Some more demonstrations here. You can see how it looks when Kazuya crouch versus when Kazuya blocks. And also you can see Jin's hit trajectory of it. Here's an aerial view. You can see once again the trajectory, the block, the connections, just giving you a little bit of insight on how the moves are connecting with one another. So this one is the conversation is going to change a little bit more. Here's some of those older pictures I was telling you guys about of when Evo was first starting off. It doesn't look like Evo, but this is Evo in its early stages. So this is like early stages of Evo. And in this segment, he was basically talking about, here's Michael Murray and Harada playing Tekken Tournament 2. He was talking about how when they first showed up, they just were like sightseeing. You know, they heard about this scene in America, in EU, and they just traveled and they were just there. And when they first showed up, people were surprised to see them, like, oh, the creators of the game that I play, what are you guys doing here? And eventually, as they continued to show up and as these places grew in size, they were like, maybe it will be cool to do some announcements here. But this is when they first started to hatch the idea of showing things off. And they kind of just incorporated all of this stuff. You have players, you have tournaments, you have announcements, and they turned it into like a very successful thing. And when you think back to how Tekken 7 was able to sell all the copies it is, they contributed to all of these factors.